Alright, we are in lesson 21. Our objective says I will be able to solve, that's an O, so go ahead and fill in one step equations using multiplication and division and inverse operations. So I'll be able to solve one-step equations using multiplication, division, and inverse operations. Let's put too many ands in there. The and should be marked out. So multiplication, division, and inverse operations. So in lesson 19, we looked at one-step equations using addition and subtraction. Today we're going to look at multiplication and division. So to find the solution of an equation, what you've got to do is isolate the variable using inverse operations. You must use the same inverse operation on each side of the equation. So the inverse equations that are the inverse of each other. Addition and subtraction are inverse. Multiplication and division are inverse. Inverse means the same thing as opposite. So last week, we looked at how the addition and subtraction properties of equality, what we'll see is that the same thing holds for multiplication and division. If you do the same operation with the same number to both sides of the equation, it does not change the value. So here's an example. It is true that 2 equals 2. That statement is true. Now if you take that 2, and on each side of the equation, you multiply it by 3, you're going to get the same thing that you started with. Or you're going to get a true statement. Not the same thing that you started with, but you are going to get a true statement. So 2 equals 2. Well, if I multiply 2 by 3 on both sides, I get that 6 equals 6. I still get a true equation. So if you multiply both sides of the equation by the same number, you're going to get a true equation just like you started with. Same thing with division. If you divide both sides of the equation by the same number, you're going to get a true statement. Okay? So what that means is if I'm trying to solve an equation, what I can do is I can isolate the variable by performing the same operation with the same number on both sides. So I've got here x divided by 6. Remember last week we talked about splitting our equation down the middle, splitting it up into, you can write goons and goblins. That's the last time I'm going to write that. You can write it if it helps you. You don't have to. Okay? Now, what I've got to do is I've got to figure out what operation is with the variable in my equation. So here what's with the variable is division. Okay? This variable x is being divided by 6. So to get rid of that division, or to get the variable by itself, what I want to do is I want to do the opposite of this division. The opposite of division, if we look up here, is multiplication. So whatever is being divided here, remember this fraction bar means division. Whatever's being divided here, I can do the exact opposite. The opposite of division is multiplication. So I'm going to multiply both sides by 6. Remember that dot right there means multiplication. So multiply this 8 by 6. Now what happens right here is these 6's cancel out. Here's why. Okay? If I've got, say for example, any number. This is just to show you why these 6's cancel out. If I've got a 2, if I multiply that 2 by 3, I get 6. Okay? And then if I take that 6 and divide it by 3, I'm going to get the 2 that I started out with. So if I multiply and divide a number by the same value, so if I multiply and divide by 6, or if I multiply and divide by 3, or if I multiply and divide by any number, it's like I didn't do anything to that value. So this x right here, if I both multiply and divide it by 6, all that's going to happen is I'm going to be left with an x. And then here on the right side, or the goblin side, I've multiplied that 8 by 6. 8 times 6 equals 48. That's my answer, because those 6's have canceled, and all I'm left with is this x right here. And then since I multiplied this side by 6, what's good for the goon is good for the goblin. I'm going to have to multiply that side by 6 as well. So x is equal to 48. It says to check your solution. To check it, all you got to do is plug your answer back into the original equation. So I'm going to replace that x with 48. Is it true that 48 divided by 6 equals 8? Yeah, that's true. 48 divided by 6 is 8. 8 equals 8. So that equation checks out. Okay? Let's do the same thing here. Now again, what I like to do is I like to take the values and flip them to where your variable is over on the left, or the goon side. So 1/4 w equals negative 11. Okay? Now, what I've got right here is I've got this 1/4 written right next to this w. When it's written right next to it like that, that means multiplication. To get rid of multiplication, I want to do the opposite of multiplication, which is division. So I can divide each side by 1/4. But what I remember is that dividing by a fraction is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So what I'm going to do right here is I'm going to multiply each side by the reciprocal of 1/4, which is 4 over 1, or just 4. So I multiplied both sides by the reciprocal. Remember, to get rid of multiplication, we use division. So I could have divided each side by 1/4, but dividing by 1/4 is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So what happens is those cancel. Any number multiplied by its reciprocal just gives you 1. So 1 times w is just w. Those cancel, so I've got w equals negative 11 times 4, that's negative 44. Negative 44. So, it says to check, make sure this is true. I've got that negative 11 equals 1/4 times w. W is negative 44. I can plug this back in as negative 44 over 1. Alright, is it true that negative 11 equals 1/4 times negative 44? Yeah, I've got negative 44 over 4, which simplifies to negative 11. Negative 11 equals negative 11. That checks out. I just plugged that negative 44 back into my original equation to make sure that it was correct. Okay, let's do the same thing here. It says to solve, then check the solution. Alright, so what I've got to do here, I've got 5x equals 20. First thing I do, split it down the middle. Split it down the middle. Then what I need to do, figure out what operation is going on the same side as the variable. What operation is going on the same side as this x? Well, 5 written right next to x, that's multiplication. To get rid of multiplication, I use the opposite, which is division. So I divide each side by 5. Okay? Those cancel. Those cancel. If I multiply and divide the same number, or multiply and divide this x by 5, all I'm left with is x. So I've got x equals 20 over 5. 20 over 5 is just 4. So x equals 4. It says to check, so let's check. It says 5x equals 20, so let's plug it right back in. 4 times 5 equals 20. Is that true? What is 4 times 5? Well, it's 20. 20 equals 20, so that checks out. Alright, let's do C right here. 2/5 P equals 7. First thing I've always got to do, every single time, take your equation, split it right down the middle. Okay? I've got 2/5 written right next to P. 2/5 written right next to P, that means multiplication. To get rid of multiplication, I use division. I'm going to rewrite this one because it's going to make it a little easier. I use division, so I want to divide each side by 2/5. I remember that dividing by a fraction is the same thing as multiplying by the reciprocal. So I multiply each side by the reciprocal of 2/5, which is 5/2. Those will cancel. I've got a whole number multiplied by a fraction. Put the whole number over 1. I've got P equals 7 times 5, which is 35. 2 times 1, which is 2, so that's 35/2. I'm fine with you leaving it as 35/2. If you wanted to simplify it, you would also get P equals 17 5/10. Those are the same thing. We're going to skip the check on this one. But yes, those are the same thing. 35/2 and 17/5. Alright, last one. Actually, yeah, no, we'll do this one. It says Anna is an architect. She is designing a rectangular room that has an area of 126 feet. If the length of the room is 12 feet, what is its width? So, first thing we've got to do is think about what we know in this formula. It says that this room is a rectangle. This room is a rectangle, and it has an area of 126 feet. If the length of the room is 12 feet, what is its width? Well, we know that the formula for the area of a rectangle is area equals your length times your width. Now let's just fill in what we know. Well, we know the area is 126. We know that the length is 12, so all we don't know is the width, which we can leave as W. Now all we've got is a real simple one-step equation. I'm going to flip this over to where your variable is on your left side. Then all I've got to do is solve this. I've got 12 written right next to W. That means multiplication. To get rid of multiplication, I use division. Divide each side by 12. I've got W equals 126 divided by 12, which equals 10.5. So, the width is 10.5 feet. Okay? I knew that box that in. I knew that the formula for the area of a rectangle was the length times the width. Then I just plugged in what I knew. I knew the area, I knew the length, I didn't know the width, so I could just solve for the width really quickly by using inverse operations. That is all for that lesson.